their view about what is at stake in the current state of the Eurozone. So without delay, I would like to give the floor to Professor Jacob Frankel, chairman of JP Morgan Chase International, who will first provide a background about the state of play in Europe and in the Eurozone specifically, and will moderate the debate with the other leaders. Jacob, can I give you the floor?
Thank you very much, Mark. It's a delight to be here again. I just want to make sure that people can hear me, not because of me, because my fellow panelists will use the same microphone. So can people in the end hear me? Yes. I assume you cannot see me, but we don't have a podium. That's life. So the subject that was assigned is a decade of adjustment and unemployment in the Eurozone, the political and economic dimension. I think that we could have no better collection of speakers that can address this matter. We have here the very top economic analysts, we have the very top political leaders, we have the very top comprehensive view of the world, and you will see as I introduce the speakers very briefly that indeed this is the case. As moderator of this session, Mark Uzan, who is the father of this entire event, asked me to be more of an active moderator, namely to take 10 minutes in order to put down challenges that I believe are facing the Eurozone system, and these challenges will be addressed by my fellow colleagues. I want to start from one perspective. 2 years ago, when the crisis was at its peak, there were serious questions, including here in Astana, on the future of the Euro system. And there were people who said that the Eurozone was a historical accident that may have to be dismantled. And there were others who said, probably not. I think that the experience that has been with us since gave some credibility to the statement that says the euro as a currency and the Eurozone as a concept is here to stay. However, there are significant challenges that are here to be solved because the solution to them will improve the standard of living of many people. The reason why we focus here about unemployment and employment is that it is not only a major economic issue, it is also a major political issue, and that's the rationale for the connection of people around this table. Let me start very quickly with some panoramic view of the world. The world in the past 20 years has gone through a dramatic change. Well, not only the euro was born a decade ago or a little more, but the entire center of gravity of the world has changed. Just to give you one overall picture is how world output was distributed in 1990 and how it is distributed today. In 1990, 2/3 of world output emanated from the three blocks: US, Europe, Japan. 2/3. Today, only 45%. Where did it all go? Well, we know the story. It went to emerging markets in general and Asia in particular. This means that there is great urgency of addressing the issues that we are having in front of us, because otherwise Europe, which was 15 years, 20 years ago, was 27% of world output and is today much less, only 20%, will become more and more marginal. So it's important to bring it back to the center, and this is one of the topics we are talking. What are the challenges that we have? We have in growth, we have unemployment, we have competitiveness, and etc. To give you an idea, you can see how divergent Europe or the Eurozone has become when it comes to growth patterns. To begin with, of course, we are all in the same boat, so when one country goes down, everyone goes down, and when one goes up, everyone goes up. However, the gaps are still very significant, and we want to ask ourselves, why does it happen? How can we deal with it? And for this, we need to go first to the most important sensitive issue, unemployment. As you can see, when the euro was introduced, the unemployment rate was very similar within the zone, across countries. And now there is great divergence. You have Greece, 25% unemployment. We have Spain, 25% unemployment on the one hand. You have the Germany, 6.9% unemployment on the other hand. Great gap. In addition to the social issue and political issue, there is a fundamental economic issue, which is we have a single monetary policy because there is only one European Central Bank, which means that the fiscal authorities are the only ones that can make calibration. But if the unemployment rate that is faced by Mr. Schauble, the minister from Germany, is 6.9, and he needs to talk to his colleague from Spain when it's 25%, it's a different conversation. And we need to ask ourselves, why did it all happen? There is something very fundamental, which is, if we look at various measures of productivity, economists define unit labor cost or something like this. How much does it cost to produce a single unit of output? And if the year 2000 is calibrated to be 100, so we have a calibration, then in the 10, 12 years that passed, look what happened. What was used to cost 100 in the year 2000 is now costing in Germany 111 or 110, but in Italy 140, and everything in between. So it means that the country's competitiveness has changed dramatically during the period, and even though they had the same monetary policy, the economic destiny which governs production has been different. We will need to ask why. Second, we know that some countries, in particular Germany, have had large surplus throughout the period. Other countries, all of them, had large deficits in the current account of the balance of payments. This means that Germany found markets abroad, and without these markets, they would not have been able to produce as much. So the current account has become an important factor, but the imbalances have been part of the scenery for a long time. Normally, when one country runs large deficit for a long time, it has to finance it. And if it finances it, it has to go to the capital market. And when it goes to the capital market, the cost of borrowing eventually comes back to punish it. What is fascinating during the Eurozone system period was a very fascinating statistic, which is, you know, when Germany goes to the market and borrows, it pays whatever the government borrowing cost for 10 years bond, it pays according to the risk that the market assesses German debt to be. If Greece goes to the market, then it will be to Greek debt. When Italy goes to the market, it will be Italian debt. So you would have expected that the various governments can go to the markets and borrow, each one at its own different rate. And here I want to show you one important statistic. It is called the spread. As you can see, since the introduction of the euro, what we have here is we measure the spread between the borrowing rate that Italy or Spain or France, here it is Italy and Spain, have from German rate. And as you can see, before the euro was introduced, both Spain and Italy, and I can tell you everyone else, had to borrow at cost which is higher than German one, because the markets recognized that German debt is safer. Since the introduction of the euro, this spread shrunk, almost vanished, which meant that if you ran deficit, you could continue to borrow at a very low rate, almost at a German risk rate, and if indeed this is the case, it's fine. But if it is a reflection that the market did not price risk, did not assess it properly, then it's not fine. And indeed, since 2008 or so, when the crisis erupted, you see how the spreads and the cost of borrowing went up again. The question is, has capital market misled us? Has it been an enabler that caused us not to realize how much risk there is in the system? The next point that I want to make is about budget deficit and current account. If you look at all the countries in the Eurozone, what you can see is that there is a combination of countries, in this case it is Greece and Spain, that are having significantly larger current account deficit and budget deficit. If you look at a different measure, which is low saving and large budget deficit, again, you have those countries. In other words, when we speak about the crisis, we need to connect it to macroeconomic policies. Let me make two more observations. Many people have compared the United States with Europe and said, well, the United States has had unemployment rate which was declining, and Europe has unemployment rate that was rising. The question is it a fair assessment? Is it a fair statement? And my answer is, it's only a partial fair statement. One of the reasons why the unemployment rate in the United States has declined so much is that labor force participation has declined. People got discouraged and left the labor force. So the statistics show a lower unemployment rate. And by the same logic, one of the reasons why the unemployment in Europe has gone up so much is because labor force participation, in fact, went up. And look at the chart that shows you how labor force participation indeed behaved. In the United States, it declined. In Europe, it went up. And as a result, we have unemployment rates that go in the way they go. The reason why I mention it is to highlight again the point that when we talk at labor market, there are structural issues that are relevant. It's not just how much money the ECB is printing. And to make the point a little bit stronger, I want you to look at one more chart, which has to do with education. Unemployment rate in Europe is about 12.1% on average. The emphasis is on average. But it depends very much on education. If you have gone to college, your unemployment rate is only 7.2%. And if you did not finish high school, then your unemployment rate is closer to 20%. In other words, what we see is a reflection of the structure of the labor force, of the education. And if we look and ask, and what needs to be done about it? Suppose you print more money, will it help? Of course not. The issue is structural, the issue is long-term. And if we speak about structural and long-term, this is now the last perspective that I want to make, is 2 points. First, in all the parts of the world we have had the financial crisis, which was related to excessive leverage. Everyone was borrowing, households were borrowing, financial institutions were levered, governments were levered, and with the correction of the crisis, leverage started to decline. But look what happens here. In the United States, leverage of the household sector has declined significantly. In Europe, leverage has not yet declined. In Japan, it has declined somewhat. So if you believe that there is still need to deleverage, then in Europe there is still a long way to go, which means the adjustment is not around the corner, it will be longer term. And if we talk about the long term, the last remark is about demography. And this will be my last chart. Europe, as well as the rest of the world, but in particularly Europe in this regard, is aging. Within 20 years, the total population in Europe will be larger than what it is now by 16 million people. But where will they be? They will all be in the cohorts above 60 years and above. If you are between 60 and 69, 70 and 79, 80 plus, that's where you have more people in the population. If you are younger than 60, in 20 years you will have less and less friends around you. You better become more than 80 if you have more friends. In other words, the nature of society, which is aging, that's a longer term challenge. We spoke today about innovation, about technology, about dynamism. Well, a society that is aging has a problem in it. It means that one needs to reflect again about education and about immigration policies and the like. So let me conclude here by noting the obvious. I'm a former central banker, and I did not mention the word money. I did not mention the word European Central Bank. And not because I think it is not important, I think it is extremely important. And I think that what the ECB has been doing recently was very, very important and positive. But the real solution to the fundamental issues of employment, the structure of employment, growth, productivity, are structural economic measures which belong to the governments, and governments that do not use the time that is given to them by the monetary authority, those are the governments that waste the credit and will not improve the destiny of their population. So this is the list of challenges that I had in mind, and I think that what I would like to do is to tell you the menu of extraordinary dishes that you are going to be presented here in the next period. First, we have with us His Excellency, Mr. Romano Prodi. Mr. Romano Prodi is the last one that needs introduction. In fact, nobody needs an introduction. But that's unfair because, you know, those who do not need introduction always are not introduced. And those who need introduction, you say, why do I need to know that? So I might as well introduce all of them as properly. So His Excellency Romano Prodi, Prime Minister of Italy, twice during 96 to 98, in the run-up to the euro, the one that used seriously the challenge of convergence in order to make Italy ready. Unfortunately, he was not there to carry it through, so the Italians decided to go somewhat differently. President of the European Commission, and has been in the news recently time and again. Some of us were disappointed with the outcomes, and we don't talk politics here. The next speaker would be Professor Antonio Pizarrides, who is a Nobel laureate, of course, you all know, in economics. He is a president of he is a senior advisor to the president of Cyprus, so you can guess that he's a Cypriot. He is a professor of economics at the London School of Economics, and as I said, Nobel laureate for the year 2010. We have with us His Excellency Dominique Strauss-Kahn, a former managing director of the International Monetary Fund, who frankly, at least some of us believe that if he was there at the time that after he left, a lot of trouble could have been saved to the world. But I can tell you also, I've known him much earlier when he was still a very prominent Minister of Finance of France, and we are, in addition to mutual admiration, we are good friends. We have with us His Excellency Mr. Alfred Gusenbauer, who was the 11th Chancellor of Austria during critical years of 2007, 2008, and he will, of course, touch on the issues of the unemployment as a challenge to democracy from the areas that he has the most perceptive views. We have with us His Excellency Mr. Wim Kok, who is indicated here as the president of the Club of Madrid. I remember him very well as a very prominent prime minister of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and prior to this, we worked together a lot when he was the Minister of Finance. So I don't think we can have a better list of people who will address these issues. So let me, without further ado, leave the floor to Romano Prodi, please.
Thank you for the presentation, but you have told everything, now I have nothing to add to what you told. You are too wise, and I want only to make some observation to the picture you did, because it's the correct introduction to our work, The task of today is to draw from these general macroeconomic figures, if it is possible, an adjustment for unemployment and in the Eurozone, and which policy can be taken for that. We have to discuss this in 10 minutes. This is not an easy job. First of all, we are speaking about economic crisis. In macroeconomic terms, there is no economic crisis in the world. It's the average growth this year is among the best year we never considered in the recent economic history. Asia is growing well. Even Africa is around 5%. South America, not bad. United States from 2 to 3%. And the crisis is a European crisis. European growth is 0, and so we cannot speak of a world crisis. It's a special case of adjustment of European policy. And it's, global growth is going in the right direction. European growth is going in the wrong direction. And so it's not surprised that there is the highest level of unemployment, for the reason that Frank explained it before, the demand for labor is increasing in Europe, but also for the simple reason that when you have years and years of no growth or negative growth, you have unemployment. And this is the European situation. And so it's with the 0 growth that we have for so many years, unemployment is the clear consequence. Of course, please, this is my personal opinion. I don't want that to be followed, but I do think also that we have some structural problem that in the future can go beyond Europe, The information revolution, the net revolution is something different from the old ones. When we had the cars, of course, the horse farmers, they were unhappy, but in few years, new streets, refineries, fuel station, car factories, they replaced all the manpower that was displaced in the old times, you know. And this happened with the electricity, this happened with the railroad. With the information revolution is much more difficult, you know, because you displace people in a very different manner. All the secretaries disappeared, almost all, you know. The accountants disappeared. The designers in the big companies disappeared, you know, and this is taken piece by piece, step by step around all the society, you know. And this is something that Europe suffered more because we didn't have the new software and the new hardware. This was divided between the United States and China. And so when you are out of total global innovation, you suffer. And the number of new jobs is unbelievably lower than the number of the jobs lost. You know, this is a reality. And second, because of globalization, Europe with the wage and salaries much higher than the average suffered more. And the purchasing power decreased because of Chinese competition, because of globalization, and so this has made a phenomenon that is now typically European, that is the internal demand that is collapsing. If you take Italy, for example, or Germany, Germany is growing zero now, but exports, they went very well. In Italy, the export is going fairly well, but we have minus 2 point something this year because of the collapse of internal demand. And we live in a very contradictory society in Europe, you know, because we ask people to buy more and we pay people less. And this is a contradiction, you know, and this is why, you know, getting from this into the problem of austerity, we must make some question mark, you know. Austerity is necessary for the strong adjustment when you have the market that reacts like Frankel told. But you can't go on with austerity forever because you have this split between, you know, purchasing power and you know, the needs, and then you cannot fill it up and you have a negative growth. When you have a negative growth and you look only to the nominator that say public expenditure and not to the denominator, the growth, you put the economy in a disaster. And this is what it happened in European countries. But you can't go out of this nightmare if you have not a common agreed policy. And this is the problem, because Italy cannot do it alone, because the imbalance will increase. We should need now, in this moment, a German impulse to the economy. It is a dream. It is a logical consequence of simple figures. Germany has a zero growth. Germany has almost zero inflation. Germany has a fantastic balance of trade, you know. Per capita income is higher than China. The real China in the world is Germany, is not China. You know, the imbalance is being broken. And because of political reasons, that any concession to the growth should be interpreted like a gift to the lazy southern people like me, you know, this makes the German electorate uneasy. And so before the election, I don't think that nothing will be done. And so I don't think that for the unemployment that is the subject today, there will be a concrete action. I know that there is a proposal now by France, Italy, Spain, to have some active action, and I think that positive consequences will follow with an increase of targeted specific public intervention. But in this case, all the results of that are very, very, very limited, you know. And the problem of a common economic policy is really the nightmare of Europe. And till we don't have really a common policy that will bring down the spread, as it was explained in the previous presentation, we shall not have any change, any substantial change. Of course, in the long run, education, as Frankel told, will be very, very important. But which type of education? This is another problem for Europe, you know. We have really different types of education. Germany and Austria, they have a tradition of, let's say, empirical, practical, technical education that is much more in the center of the intellectual feeling of the country. And this now is what should needed for Europe. Because Europe, and nobody thinks about that, is going in different direction, even in the real economy. If we take the very simple statistic that really generally ignored, because the economists now are mainly macroeconomists, you know, and the microeconomists like me, industrial economists, you know, they are in some way in the margin of the science. But when you take the statistics of the added value of manufacturing, you find that there are two Europe. There is Germany, in which you have now, after the crisis, I have not the most recent statistics, but you have around 26% of added value in pure manufacturing. I mean pure manufacturing, no building industry, no nothing, public works, pure manufacturing. But in France, you are around 11%, 26, 11. UK, still less. Italy is always a bivalent country. You have 17, because you have, like Germany, from Florence to the Alps, and like UK and France from the Alps to Sicily, you know. But how can you manage without a strong common policy, a continent in which you have so different economic structure like that, you know? And this is a problem that is always underestimated. Why you have this low unemployment in Germany? Well, growth and export, of course, but this is a consequence of a different structure of the economy and of a different educational structure of people. And, you know, we are in Kazakhstan, and I am happy that Nazarbayev mentioned vocational school in his speech yesterday, you know, because the future of a country is not to build a top university or like that. It is to build a top university with vocational school, with primary school. Is the countries, they progress together, you know. And in many European countries, we have still a split between the vocational, technical, and, let's say, high-level scientific R&D structure. This is the reality, and I think that are the instrument to fight in the long term against unemployment. You know, the last problem is, look, aging population. That's true that aging population is a problem, but it is a problem also because we believe that this becomes a problem. Because if we adopt more flexible agreements for retired people, let's say we have periods in which they do half job, half full-time jobs, and we have flexible, different sector by sector. Of course, the non-working group in our society will diminish. And, you know, and even more, let's say the female work is more important than the problem of aging. And we don't exploit, we don't give the occasion to the female work to be in the market, you know. As you know, this doesn't go many times in the statistics because the women did not present in the labor market, but they are an instrument, a fantastic instrument for growth. These are the political instruments that we have to adopt. But, and then I end, because my time is already expired, I end with, let's say, coming a bit back to the macroeconomic problems, you know. Please, don't think that the euro will disappear. There was a danger last summer, but with the intervention of the European Central Bank and the consequent decision, we shall go on with a period of, let's say, slow adjustment. I say slow because before the German election, there will be only minor decision. But as you have seen, the French president, he was much more open to some idea of federal Europe. Let's say, the efforts for the agreement there go on. They will be very slow because of German election. Then we shall have European election. So we need a period of adjustment. But don't think that the euro will disappear, you know. Even the Germans, they are the first one to know that. When Soros proposed it, it was a, let's say, provocation, but so intelligent. He's always, let's German get out of the euro, you know. But which will be the results? The rate of exchange between the German euro and the non-German euro will go not to 1.2, 1.3, but will go to 2.5, you know. And the German will never export anything, you know. And last observation, please, Germany can play a role in the world only if it is a part of the European industrial cluster. When we judge the world economy, we don't consider the real change. We consider only the monetary change. We don't consider the real change. We don't consider the new Asian cluster that is not Chinese only. It's China plus South Korea plus Japan plus, you know, all the area. Because we are confused by the fact that there are political quarrels. But if you analyze the trades and the integration of the Asian cluster, it's really one thing. When you see that there is an earthquake in Japan and hundreds of Chinese companies stop because of the lack of intermediate products, this is the signal that something new is happening, you know. And this reality is going on and on. And if Europe does not make some, I don't say equivalent cluster because Asia is bigger, but something that with different skills is a big cluster, will certainly give up to its role, and certainly in this case it will be impossible to tackle the unemployment problem. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prodi, and we are moving on immediately to our Nobel laureate, Professor Pissarides. Please.
Thank you very much, Jacob, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to talk explicitly about the Eurozone, having been involved so deeply with the Cyprus negotiations recently, and leave unemployment to others, despite my academic interests. I do have slides which I see have come up on screen. So what I'm going to say, you're going to see written up on the slides as well. Well, first of all, let's begin at the beginning, as it were, the single market in Europe and beyond. And I think the single market in Europe has been very good for jobs and growth in Europe as a whole, for the reasons that that Romano Prodi has just outlined right at the end of his talk as well. Trade expanded. The poorer countries of the South have caught up with the North, more or less. Internal migration has removed bottlenecks. It's moving in both directions. I do think on this something uncontroversial, but something that Europe has been dragging its feet. It's essential to complete the single market in services as well. What we have now is a single market in goods trade, but not in services yet, because I believe that the future of Europe, especially the future of employment in Europe, lies in the service sector. Now, the next step in the process of European integration, which I thought at the time at least that it was a very good idea, was the introduction of the single currency. In fact, for 7 years I was a member of the Cyprus Monetary Policy Committee, which was responsible for introducing the euro to Cyprus, and we thought we had cause to celebrate in 2008 when we managed to bring the euro to Cyprus. Champagne opened, Trichet came to Cyprus and revealed the golden euro to us. Of course, looking back, maybe that celebration was a bit premature, but that's what we have now. I believe that the single currency now and the restrictions that it imposed on the continent of Europe has backfired on us. It's holding back growth and job creation. I believe that the present situation is very unsatisfactory, and the Eurozone should either be dismantled completely in a cooperative way, or the leading countries, especially Germany, should do the necessary as fast as possible and to make the Eurozone more growth and employment friendly. And I believe that if they're going to do that, they need to go at full speed for banking union and fiscal union in a way that I'm going to explain in a minute. Now, banking union is the less controversial one, that we do need it, and we need it in the sense that we need a common bank supervisor. What the initial agreement about the Eurozone was to have a common monetary policy, which is embodied in the European Central Bank. The founding fathers at the time thought that common supervision was not necessary, but it's obvious now that it is necessary, given experience since then. Either the European Central Bank or some other institution needs to decide which banks should be dissolved and how recapitalization should be done. We urgently need Eurobonds. I cannot see how one could support a common currency but not Eurobonds. We do need the European stability mechanism that could recapitalize banks without creating unsustainable sovereign debts. Because the problems that we have now in Europe is that if a banking system needs more money, then that money is given through the government, is creating sovereign debts, and that makes the sovereign debt unsustainable, and as a result, governments cannot go out into the open markets and borrow for their development projects, and therefore the banking debts or the behavior of bankers influences the development policy of the government. Is exactly what we've been seeing in the countries that have been forced to go to the IMF and the Eurozone, the Troika, for support, which is given under very stringent conditions. Now, so much about monetary union. What about fiscal union? I believe that we also need fiscal union, and I also think that the European Commission is now coming around to that view, or rather maybe they had it before me actually, when I say it's not under my influence that it's coming around to that view. By that I mean that we need at least some central control of individual country fiscal finances. Fiscal transfers, of course, are already taking place in Europe through the structural funds and the stability mechanisms, but obviously that's not enough. And if we are going to use the extended European stability mechanism or Eurobonds or whatever to bring into effect bigger fiscal transfers between countries, we also need to have more central control of individual country budgets, much stricter than what the Maastricht criteria required, because that will make them more acceptable to individual countries and will make them more effective in dealing with sovereign debts. Now, if we continue as at present, which essentially plodding along with haphazard decision-making, as happened in the case of Cyprus recently, for example, and I can give you all the glorious details if you had time, we follow inconsistent debt relief policies across countries. For example, the policies that were followed in Greece, Cyprus, and Ireland are completely different from each other and completely taken the individual countries completely by surprise as to what the Troika each time decided. There are policy pronouncements that are put forward only to be withdrawn when markets don't like it. You know, after the Cyprus bailout, the president of the chairman rather of the Eurogroup said that that's a template for future bailouts. Markets reacted very negatively to that. Within 2 or 3 hours, he withdrew the remark. He said it was taken out of context. Now, what context I'd like to hear what context was different. He was talking about the Cyprus bailout and what it teaches us about the Eurozone. It was obviously some terrible mistake that they realized after the event. Continuing like that obviously will get us nowhere in Europe. Fiscal austerity, which is imposed to support all that mechanism, is destroying jobs. And as has just been said, in fact, by Romano Prodi, the rest of the world is coming out of crisis, is moving ahead, and taking on new technological challenges, and we in Europe are just sitting back, looking at fiscal deficits and arguing between us and waiting for the next pronouncement to come out of Germany to see if there is any hope of any change of policy, which so far hasn't been. And you can see that in unemployment in the industrialized world. The Eurozone is painted red, and you can see that in the high unemployment countries on the right are all the countries that are going through the mechanism of the fiscal austerity and structural reforms and debt reduction. When I did it, the order was Spain, Greece, Cyprus, Portugal, Ireland. I think now Greece has overtaken Spain by a small margin, but that's irrelevant. Their unemployment is just prohibitively high. I should also point out here that the old myth when people were comparing US and Europe, saying that Europe has high unemployment because of social policies and welfare states and all that is complete nonsense. You can see the countries that had the very high unemployment rates do not have a social welfare state, in fact, because they're bankrupt. They didn't have it before. They didn't have much of a welfare state before, but now they definitely don't have any. I mean, Greece, Spain, Cyprus have absolutely nothing in the form of social transfers that could justify any kind of unemployment. You know, 50% youth unemployment is not supported by policies that give less incentive to Greeks or Cypriots or Spaniard youths to take jobs. There are simply no jobs because of the macroeconomic policies followed. Now, what do we do? Well, as we're coming out of the debt crisis, Europe needs to prepare for job-rich growth, and that's what the European Commission is trying to do, but they don't have much power, in fact, to impose it. But what we need desperately is some policies that will bring the unemployed back to jobs. And what I'm going to say next are the obvious things that you probably heard of before, but there's no harm in repeating them because they haven't been implemented. First of all, what about infrastructure? Well, after years of austerity and structural reform, Europe needs new infrastructure programs. And these programs, I believe, should be coordinated at European Union level rather than leave them to individual countries, because I do believe they should be outside the recurrent budget. When a company is doing investments, it doesn't look at its costs and expenditure, costs and revenues in 12-month periods. It looks at the costs now, which is the time that is making the investment, and then the revenue over the life of the investment budget. This is not what governments do. Governments look at their budget year by year, and when the Troika is looking at budget deficits and imposing austerities on that budget year by year. Now, there is lip service to development projects being left outside the budget, but in fact they are not. The money that you spend on the development budget is counted as part of your expenditure. Now, I believe those should be taken out of the current budget if we're going to see growth coming back to Europe. Now, the obvious question, and it's a criticism that has been made before when I said that, is how do you know what's development or what's investment project and how do you know what isn't? Well, it's fairly easy why to do it. Don't leave it to individual governments to tell you, because then they will say everything is a development project. Set up some institution in Brussels and let it monitor competitiveness and investments and productivity across the countries of the Union and decide what project is a development project and what isn't. Now, those projects might be different in each country. You know, some countries might need tourist projects if they have the sunshine. Other countries might need transport, others might need telecommunications. If you have a centralized institution, it will be able to tell you that. Now, I also mentioned fiscal union, of course, and again, how do you bring about that? Well, again, you need a new institution. So far, in practice, we only have one centralized Eurozone institution, which is the European Central Bank. The others are not really powerful as Eurozone as such. I also think we need a fiscal policy council to monitor the fiscal budget of the Eurozone. It shouldn't have executive powers, but at least should be able to monitor them and report. But we do need a growth and competitiveness council to evaluate the reforms needed to increase growth and competitiveness in the countries of the Union, especially the ones going through the Troika-imposed austerity programs right now. And the Growth and Competitiveness Council should be looking at applications for individual countries and approve spending that is outside the budget balance. You know, for example, I can give you an example. Greece got a new airport about maybe 7 to 8 years ago. The area of the old airport, which is in a really nice tourist area, is on the coast near Athens. It's completely undeveloped yet because they don't have the money to develop it. That's such an obvious investment infrastructure project that would create loads and loads of jobs in a country that has 27% unemployment. And it's such an obvious project to be funded by this kind of this kind of program that I'm mentioning, Growth and Competitiveness Council programs. Now, I haven't said anything at all about labor markets, and I feel that I won't be true to my academic research if I don't. It is true that the labor market needs to be more flexible, especially in the southern countries, if the Eurozone is going to see growth coming back and full employment. Now, what flexibility in my mind means is more freedom of employers to run their businesses without too much regulation. Minimum wages should be set at appropriate levels to encourage labor supply, but not discourage job creation. Something like 40 to 45% of the median is about right. 60%, which is what France has, obviously isn't right. But there aren't many countries that have that kind of high levels of minimum wages. And I believe in France it's coming out, if I'm right. I haven't followed the recent policy changes there. It is the case that the best job security to a worker is not provided by the government that imposes restrictions on employers to fire the worker. The best job security is provided by a flexible labor market that creates a lot of jobs all the time. So if a worker loses his or her job, then they know that there is another job being created somewhere else immediately, and they go and take it. Unemployment is then short-term, and that is not a worry to workers. What's a worry to workers is long-term unemployment, which is created by the government restrictions on employers to fire workers. That's the kind of inconsistency, apparent inconsistency in the minds of unions that they really have to see if we're going to move forward in this. Now, you might still say, what about income security when workers are in between jobs, even if it's short-duration jobs? Well, that should be provided by the government in the form of unemployment insurance. And if workers still remain unemployed after 6 months, maybe 12 months in recession, then you might have programs to support them. But if you have a flexible labor market, you are not going to get many people reaching 12-month unemployment. That, of course, is the basis of what they call the flexicurity system, which I think it works effectively, but priority should be on the flexibility on the workers, on the employer side. Then structural reform, well, many countries still lack the flexible labor market that I outlined. They do have to go through structural reforms. And I do have to say that recent reforms associated with debt reduction programs, especially in Spain, in fact, but also in Greece, they are in the right direction. But they're taking a lot of time to have an effect. And that's the state where we are now, where the policies are being implemented, but they haven't had an effect yet on the labor markets. And they do need the full cooperation of all the social partners. And my only worry about that is what comes on the next slide, which is the last one, that the austerity that is being imposed simultaneously with those structural reforms has an immediate impact on the economy, and it's got such large negative effects, like the unemployment rates I showed you before, that those negative effects will undermine the reform programs themselves and make it more difficult to get full cooperation of the social partners in implementing the programs. So given what we know about the timing of austerity and the impact that it has on the economy, which is immediate, and the lag in the effect of structural reforms, which is something like between 3 and 5 years, we know that from Germany's experience under Schröder, for example, from 2002 and 2005, then it's important to give time to the structural reforms to have an effect on the economy of the South before you impose the austerity. So I do think the timing that is chosen for these programs has been wrong and is endangering the whole process of reform that is necessary in the South. But I repeat that the main problems that we have here are that we follow this very anti-employment policy, if you like, to reduce the debt of one policy fits all, undermining the infrastructure investment projects that might create jobs, and on top of all that, not managing to come together as 17 partners in the Eurozone to agree where the future of the Eurozone is going to be, which I think it might create so much tension within the Eurozone that it will just break up on its own unless some coordinated action is taken immediately. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And we are moving on to Dominique Strauss-Kahn. Please, Dominique, the floor is yours.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, happy to be with you this afternoon. Thank you, Jacob, for your nice introduction. We all have been asked to tell a few words about Europe and the Eurozone. And my starting point will be that now when you listen to the word Europe, you hear debt. And why so? And I think that the first reason comes from the fact that the whole debt and the debt problem has been totally underestimated by the Europeans as a whole. Remember, it was beginning of 2010, the question began to be discussed. And then when the Greek problem came at the end of 2010, beginning of 2011, at the end of 2009, beginning of 2010, the question was in Europe, no IMF. Maybe some of you do remember this. Most of the most prominent politicians in Europe said, we will deal with the problem alone, we don't want the IMF to come in, which I can understand from a political point of view. But the problem was that the European institutions were totally unequipped to deal with a problem like this. They had no experience about that. And so the fact that they decided to address the problem alone makes that maybe 6 months or a year in the Greek problem has been lost. That's just an example of the fact that the importance of the problem has been totally underestimated. Greece is only 2% of the Eurozone GDP. So you may say it's a small thing, no problem. The reality is that it may have consequences, it has had consequences on the rest of the European economy and become one of the major problems with spillover on Spain, Italy, other countries, Cyprus of course, so that the problem finally was much bigger than it appears at the beginning. One way was to kind of denying the importance of the problem. The other way for the European to underestimate the situation was to refuse to do what market people do, or entrepreneurs, where they take over a company having problem, which is to say, okay, we need to pay the debt and start again. The attitude in the European Union, as if it was a business as usual, was to say, no, we're going to pay, we're going to provide resources to Greece with the help of the IMF, but we were a really junior partner in this, and the Commission and the ECB were leading. We're going to provide resources to Greece, and they will come back to growth and repay us. But for many reasons I'm not going to elaborate on now, the situation of Greece was totally different from a traditional case of a country having a current account problem. So the fact is that instead of solving the problem, the decision has been made to postpone the problem and to push forward a snowball which has become bigger and bigger over time. And maybe you have in mind many European Council who have taken place during the last 2 or 3 years has always been the last and the most important European Council where decisions are going to be made. And then 6 months after, you had again the most important European Council where decisions are going to be made, and so on. Why? Because it's very difficult for politicians to make decisions where you just cut the cost and accept to pay your losses. As I said, market people will do. You always try to push forward the problem, avoiding to have it now. The horizon of politicians is always very short, so you may say, okay, let's push forward, maybe it will come and explode in 2 years, 1 year, 2 years of time. Who knows what will happen in 2 years of time? We better avoid to have the problem now. But in this case, it has been a very bad policy in my view, which makes that today the problem is obviously much bigger than it has been at the beginning. So that's my first point. The consequences, the size of the problem, and the consequences have been underestimated. Why so? In my view, let's be very blunt, because I think the Europeans were not equipped to deal with a problem of this kind. They were not equipped on a theoretical point of view. What most politicians have in view in Europe, not only in Europe, but what they have in mind in most countries, including Europe, is basic Keynesian economics, you say the kind of 101 lesson, with no real view on what kind of changes the globalization has created in the way you manage the economy. So the idea that if you have a good policy mix, good monetary policy and good budget, fiscal policy, even if it's difficult, as Romano said in Europe, and Jacob too, if you have this good policy mix, it's okay. So the idea that it was impossible to have a huge problem, whatever the kind of problem, not only a debt problem, any kind of big problem, in advanced economy and especially in Europe, was in mind. It could happen everywhere in the world, but not in advanced economies, because we know, they know how to manage the economy. This idea, which is old, I don't know, 2, 3 decades, 4 decades after the war, that we know how to manage advanced economies is very strong and is a kind of alibi for most European politicians not to deal with the much more complicated situation of the economy and the progress in economic theory that has taken place over time. So that's why I say most remain on this basic analysis of the economy that prevailed 50 years ago, but which doesn't work anymore in an open economy and in the globalized economy. That's on the theoretical point of view. But Europe is not equipped intellectually either. Why? Because all the European model, even if it's different in France and Germany, in Italy and in the Netherlands, relies on the idea that the less risks you take, the better it is. And even you have these days in some European countries, I won't quote any, a situation where you want to tax any individuals making any kind of profit because profit is bad. But this kind of policy and attitude makes that nobody will take any kind of risk. And it goes back to what I said before, to the capacity of politicians to cut the costs, to take the losses, and to go forward. So intellectually, during the last decades, the Europeans have moved into a system where it's very difficult from one end to the other end of the society to have an attitude where you take risk. And in crisis like this one, you need to take risk, and you need to be able Maybe you lose, maybe you win, but at least to do something, not just to wait for the solution to come alone. It goes with the same, with another side of the same coin when I meant that European politicians don't really understand what globalization means. And this idea that you can try to solve your problem alone in a closed economy and that you're not really affected by what happens at the other part of the world. So, on a theoretical point of view, analytic tools, the people were not equipped, but intellectually, Europe was not in a state of mind likely to face a kind of crisis like this one. And then, as important, and has also been mentioned by speakers before me, institutionally, the Eurozone was not correctly equipped. And this idea that the Eurozone needs some kind of body directing the system, which now has some steam, was not very well accepted before, as if it was possible to have a single currency without any kind of coordination on the fiscal side or even beyond the fiscal side. And I must confess here in Astana today that it's partly my fault. It's very pretentious to say that, but let's be pretentious. Because when the euro has been launched in '98, the Germans were fighting very hard on what they called the Stability Pact, which basically was thresholds on deficits and debt. They wanted something that avoid countries to do whatever they want. They wanted something which will constrain the different countries in the euro to be, let's say, reasonable enough. That was a very well-known 3% threshold on deficit. And we French, we were against that because we say, well, it depends. Sometimes you need more, sometimes you need less. You should not impeach the government to do something. On our side, on the French side, we said what we need is what we call at this time an economic government. What is an economic government? It's something that will organize the whole economic policy in the Eurozone, not only the monetary policy, which will be done by the ECB, but also the fiscal policy, let's say industrial policy, whatever. And at the end of the day, we had a bad stability pact and no economic government, but the reality is that we wanted the same thing, and I didn't get it. What the Germans want was, and that they clearly understand, they're not idiots, that we couldn't have a single currency without some kind of coordination. For them, coordination came from the fiscal side. For us, coordination came from more economic policy as a whole. But both the French and the German wanted the same thing, which is to add to the single currency somebody with real power that will be able to discuss with the central bank. But because on both sides we didn't understand that the partner wanted the same thing, we foughted on a political fight and obtained nothing. And during the first 10 years of the 21st century, things were not that difficult until the Lehman crisis, and it works not that bad because there were no real problem. But when the crisis appeared, then it was clear that the lack of a coordination body was really the main drawback or failure of the system. So institutionally, Europe is not equipped. And we don't have time enough to discuss on the banking union, for instance, but that's a very good example. The Europeans are talking and talking these days about implementing the banking union, which is good. And the IMF, when I was in my tenure there, and since also always has been arguing that what is needed in a system like the Eurozone is a banking union. Fine. The Europeans were very reluctant to put it in place, but with the crisis, they begin to understand that it was a need. Good. So a lot of very high-level, top-level meetings have taken place where decisions have been made. We are going to implement the banking union. And the press has big title. It's okay, the banking union will exist, it will start, so on. The problem is it doesn't happen. That's only talks and talks. It doesn't really happen. I'm a bit exaggerating. There are some step forwards, but not fast enough and not as important as it is often said, for many reasons, including the fact that many countries, including our German friends, don't want so much to have a banking union, which implies supervision from outside in their own bank. So for nationalistic reasons, many countries are resisting to more coordination, more organization of the system, even if they talk about it, and the result is that the institutions are still very weak, and that's the third reason, was a theoretical reason and the intellectual reason why the system is where it is now. The last point I would like to make on this is the question of leadership. The center is very weak, and Romano, who has been the head of the Commission, knows this more than anybody. But it's especially weak these days. I mean, especially weak when you're in a crisis system. It has always been a fight in the European system between the member states and the center. The member states trying to keep the power in Paris, in Berlin, in Rome, and the center trying to have the center of, if not a federation, at least something that will be able to impulse decisions. But with the crisis, it appears even more important than before, and the center and the imbalance between the power of the capitals and the power of the center is even bigger than before. So I know for sure many situations where the French and the German and others were so happy to be able to avoid to give any power to Brussels that they find it a very big success for them to keep the power in their own country. Unfortunately, that's not the way the system can work. You need a minimum of power at the center, and these days the power of the center is not strong enough. Moreover, with the crisis and the kind of nationalistic reaction that the crisis implies, it's probably even more difficult today to create more power, to give more power to the center than it has been in the past. So when you take this all round, you see that for years now, no real solution has been proposed, despite arguments that has been put on the table by different organizations, the IMF, the OECD, others. Many austerity programs has been put in place, which obviously today are not appropriate. And I'm one among others explaining that we cannot get out of this crisis in Europe only with austerity programs. The advisors are, in my view, not strong enough, and I think that both the OECD, the IMF, some others should be stronger, explaining to Europeans that they can't go that way forever. But why is it difficult? Why do we need advisors? It's not difficult because of technical questions. The technical problems are not that easy to solve. What is difficult to solve is the political question, to accept the political cost of starting at a new level. And of course, to be able to make political decisions, you don't need advisors. You need leaders in the European system. And because it appears to be too difficult to be done these days, no real decisions are taken, and the system goes on and on. As I'm going to conclude on this, you probably understood in what I'm saying, I'm rather pessimistic on what is on the near future. Because taken all together, the problem is not really a debt problem. The problem is, certainly we have to solve a debt problem, but that's not that difficult. The amount at stake are not that big, at least for the small countries, and I don't believe that Italy or Spain are in the same basket. The problem is not really a debt problem. The problem is the real European problem, which is a competitiveness problem. And the debt problem only is used as a front to try to avoid, to address the real problem, on which I'm not going to elaborate now, but which is the real competitiveness problem coming from the fact that the golden age of Europe is behind, and that to maintain its level of life, of standard of living in Europe, you need a lot of effort. Pizaredis talked about the labor market. He was right. That's not the only point. There are many other structural reforms. But the Europeans act as if they had to face only a financial problem, which is a debt problem that, by the way, they don't solve, to avoid to address the bigger problem, which is the big problem of Europe, which is basically the structural reform which has to be done. So I'm rather pessimistic because my forecast is that no real decisions are going to be made. At each and every moment where the situation will come close to the cliff, a decision will be taken to avoid the cliff and buy some time, 3 months, 6 months, and then back to the cliff. And so probably for, I don't know how long, but 4 years, 5 years, this part of the world will experience low growth with a lot of consequences in terms of social unrest and sometimes threats to democracy. So, in a nutshell, the problem is that having been surprised by such a crisis, which was not expected at all, the European didn't solve it, but are not in the process of solving it for the reason that because they are just lacking, in my view, more of political will than of technical tools, and that's the real problem that they have to face these days. So, Romano, you have to come back.
Thank you very much, Dominique. Before we move on, I must correct an omission in the introduction because relatively to the printed program, we have had an additional force that we welcome very much, Mr. Marcos Bonturi, who is a director at the OECD, and he always comes with wealth of knowledge and facts, so we welcome him. Let us continue immediately with Chancellor Alfred Gusenbauer. The floor is yours, and I will ask also Mr. Mark Uzan maybe to take my seat over there, because while the Chancellor is speaking, I will need to sit over there and make the next session. Please.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I can start with an agreement with the conclusion of Dominique. I agree, Romano has to come back. This is, if this is the result of our meeting today, then we have been already quite successful. And a lot has been said which I share, and therefore I will not enter the temptation that is very often present in meetings like that, where everything has been said but not by everybody. And therefore I want to highlight only some points that connect the political and economic issue with the issue of youth unemployment and the democratic challenges that are in front of us. You remember it was said that the primary and secondary system of education is crucial for the chances of the young people to find a job. And I agree. And we have the fact that, for instance, Finland has the best educational system of Europe, at least according to the available studies of the OECD. And at the same time, Finland has a rather high youth unemployment rate. At the same time, Germany and Austria are, let's say, average what concerns the quality of the educational system according to the PISA study. So they are both around place 15 to 18, but they have a rather low youth unemployment. In Austria, we have de facto no youth unemployment. So how can it be that those two countries, despite the fact of having a lower quality of primary, preschooling, and secondary education, have a lower youth unemployment? And I think one of the important answers has been given by Romano, that the question of applied qualifications and skills that really meet the necessities of your industry and of your economy, and that not in all the instances have to be university degrees, but can be technical and vocational skills. And this system of apprenticeship, which is difficult to be repeated in other places, but which at least in Austria and in Germany involves 50% of all the youngsters, offers, of course, a very close access to the labor market that at least offers the opportunity to enter quite early. So my first message is, institutions of the labor market are, in all our debates, mostly underestimated, but they can make a crucial difference of what is the result. Second comparison about success and non-success. The same people that in Russia have been the best qualified natural scientists had difficulties to find a job. When they were massively migrating to Israel, they built the nucleus of the startup nation. Because, as you know, Israel is number 2 in companies that are noted on the Nasdaq, which means high-tech companies. And the main basis for this is the enormous influx of Russian or Soviet academic natural science intelligence. What's the difference? It seems that the institutional framework in Israel, in order to found new businesses, to have venture capital, to have financial institutions that promote new business and are ready to take some risk, seem to be better equipped and more developed than in Russia. Because the same people that do not find the chances to develop in Russia are enormously successful in Israel. Third thing, we are talking about economic recovery and the importance of austerity and the different policies that are entered. It's quite interesting that in 2012, the domestic demand within the Eurozone only was increasing in Estonia, in Malta, and in Austria. In all the other countries of the Eurozone, the domestic demand was decreasing. And even if in most of the countries the exports were quite improving, the increased exports were not able to balance what has been lost on the domestic side. And as a result, we have this stagnation of the Eurozone, which in 2012 showed some very modest growth, and it seems that we will stay like that for quite some time. So the question is, what is the best recipe? And I agree that the main problem is not the debt problem. The debt problem is an expression of the problem. And the best example for that is, by the way, Spain. Spain, for many, many years, has been the top performer under the Maastricht criteria. No deficit, very low accumulated debt, low inflation, has been an excellent, and by the way, budget surplus. So has been among the top performers in the Eurozone. And immediately, with the emergence of the crisis, Spain entered a severe economic and at the end also a debt crisis. But what has been overlooked and what the Maastricht criteria never covered was, of course, that Spain had an enormous competitiveness problem, because the development of the competitivity of the economy was very flat, even lower than the Mediterranean average. And the second thing was that for quite some years, Spain had a current account deficit per capita that was the second largest in the OECD, behind the United States of America. And this shows you very clearly that the debt question, if it emerges at a certain moment, is only an expression of other problems that are there. And if one wants to maintain the European standard of living, of course, there will be an enormous pressure to improve the competitiveness in Europe. I think, of course, European initiatives can help, and I agree that investments in infrastructure, especially if they are done on the European level, could contribute. But also there is the question how to design them and where to put them. Nowadays, I think it would be not useful to build additional highways and railways in Spain, because they have an excellent infrastructure already. So the highest multiplier of a European investment in infrastructure for sure would be in Central and Eastern Europe, to build highways and railways in Bulgaria and Romania and all these new member countries of the European Union, because there is the need for it, and there the economic multiplier would be the highest. But even if the great political decision is taken that we are going for more Europe, and that we get a system that is a normal system, which means no taxation without representation, which means a political Europe where we can jointly decide about what we are doing. So let's assume that the pessimism of Dominique will not appear in reality. Even if we do that, even if we have additional investment, I don't think that on basis of the current growth rates, and even if they improve, the youth unemployment that in some of the countries has reached unprecedented levels will disappear. In countries where you have 50% youth unemployment or 30% youth unemployment, with a growth rate, if it is not 1%, but even if it's 2 or 3%, you will not get rid of youth unemployment. And therefore, I think in this context, governments also have to take the responsibility to mobilize means in budgets and in the society where you are offering job and qualification perspectives for the youngsters. And even if you cannot take all of them, but you need programs that do not allow that you get a lost generation. People that are sitting at home for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years without any possibility. What society would that be if we allow that? And I'm against dogmatic debates that say governments never can create jobs. That's wrong. I say if by all means the markets cannot provide the jobs that we need for the younger generation, then the government in addition has to take the responsibility and offer job perspectives for the youngsters. Otherwise, I would also be quite pessimistic about the democratic sustainability of our continent if we tell to an entire generation, if the market doesn't offer you a job, we cannot help you. Nobody would buy such a message.
Thank you. Let's continue our conversation, and I will ask Wim Kok, current president of the Club of Madrid, former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, to take the floor. Wim, I know that you have to leave after, if I understood, but I give you 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I speak here today as a former Prime Minister of the Netherlands and not necessarily as President of the Club of Madrid. I think the good news about Europe, we heard so much of bad news, the good news now is that we don't talk that often and that much about the risk of the Eurozone falling apart. The risk of a complete Euro crisis, although it's of course still not to be excluded in a worst case scenario. Today, financial markets have much more confidence in the future of the Euro than, let us say, only 6 or 12 months ago. And thanks to a combination of skillful crisis management, although sometimes chaotic, and leadership, with a central role at crucial moments for the central bank, the Euro now seems to have left the most turbulent times behind it. Does this now mean that you can also say that Europe has the financial crisis behind it, as President Hollande suggested last week? No, this is by no means the case. The banking crisis in Europe has not yet been brought to an end, and as long as this will be the case, it will prove to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to escape from the current recession. It has been said already, domestic demand in real terms is lower today than in 2009, that dramatic year when the pain of the worldwide financial crisis hit us most. Until now, the modest recovery of European industrial production has only been enabled by exports picking up somewhat, and domestic consumption as well as investment has hardly contributed to this. And of course, the ongoing recession is extremely worrying, and its social impact is dramatic. It's clear that the consequences of lasting structural unemployment, youth unemployment, and unemployment in general, causes a lot of social instability and has also a huge political impact. A first priority now should be speeding up the decision-making, and not only on the easy parts, but also on the more difficult parts, and the implementation process of creating a real European banking union. Not a matter for the coming 4 to 5 years, but for immediate action. And such a banking union should not be limited to only centralized supervision at European level, however important this may be in itself, but also should solve crucial issues like an EU-wide scheme to rescue and restructure troubled banks and an EU deposit insurance plan. The current financial and economic situation in Europe must be characterized as I would call it, a confidence and uncertainty crisis. Deep uncertainty about what the future will bring, and still lacking confidence amongst investors, citizens, and consumers. So banking union, the real banking union, and not talking, but really putting it into practice, is a priority number one. Not in order to solve all the problems, all the remaining problems by that means, but I mean it's an absolute necessity to do so. Having said this, it should be kept in mind that even a quick and effective removal of remaining barriers for bringing the banking crisis to an end, at this point in time still a pretty heroic assumption, will not pave the way for a return to growth rates we were used to in Europe in the past. During past decades, generations of parents have raised their children in the justified hope and expectation that, helped by their own efforts, their children could reach a better life and higher income and prosperity perspectives than they had been able to realize for themselves. For many, these old times will not come back. Europe's economic relevance in the world is gradually declining, and that process is not going to stop. And the aging society and its huge structural consequences
forces us in Europe to pursue a set of radical and fundamental reforms, including social and labor market reforms, in order to strengthen the basis for a sustainable welfare system. Too many European countries and too many European governments have lived, and perhaps sometimes even today live, with the false idea that reforms of this nature were and are not that necessary. And moreover, we failed, of course, ourselves to organize ourselves in such a way that at the European level, such fundamental reforms could be enforced. I remember, just as on a personal note, how I went after we produced a report on the European labor market and on European competitiveness, how I traveled to Chancellor Schröder and to Minister Clement to talk about the necessity for Germany to reform their labor markets, the so-called Hartz reforms. And these were introduced by Chancellor Schröder and his government. He was punished for that because he was not re-elected, and Madame Merkel became the most powerful woman on earth nowadays, according to Forbes. And I think she does a great job, but he was punished for it, for his courage. But the German population was not punished at all. They took the benefit. And that is one of the reasons why the Germans pay a much lower price for the current crisis than their fellow citizens in a number of other countries. One of the lessons I learned myself during my career as a political leader and in other responsible positions elsewhere is that delaying necessary adjustments and reforms causes, in the end, more pain, often even much more pain, especially for those who can least afford it, than biting the bullet at the moment where decisions are actually needed. And today there is an ongoing debate in Europe, of course, it has been referred to by other speakers, how to solve the current problems, and especially on austerity. Well, it's clear to everyone, I think, and also to me, that austerity alone will not bring us sufficient recovery. But it would be a huge mistake, on the other hand, to draw the wrong conclusion from this, as if it would be possible and advisable to think that we can do without austerity, that we can do without reducing public expenditure, without reducing the speed of expanding, of growing public expenditures, as if we can do without painful social and economic reforms. Stimulating the economy is by no means a one-on-one alternative for austerity. It's all about the right timing, the right policy mix, and, ladies and gentlemen, about trust and confidence. And this is my last point. The last point is about mutual confidence in the European arena, also between governments, also between populations. Europe finds itself now at crossroads. The financial, economic, and social crisis has put the European project as a whole under severe strain and brought to the surface underlying structural weaknesses we failed to deal with effectively during and after the Maastricht Treaty process and until now. And this is the moment, I think, for Europe to act, and to act decisively. In my view, there is no way back. The disintegration of the Eurozone would disastrously affect the internal market and potentially undermine the whole European project. Some people argue that the pain of the financial crisis and of the banking crisis would have been less if we would not have had the euro. For this, then we would have still allowed countries the option of devaluation. I completely disagree with that, by the way. I think we need now to work towards a stronger European economic and political architecture. And that is what needs to be done. Crisis management and strengthening the architecture. Doing what we have not done at the time of the Maastricht Treaty, what we have not done in the years, in the decade and more than a decade after the treaty, we should do it now. And probably on a step-by-step basis. Because the appetite for a grand European design and also mutual trust between member states is almost completely absent nowadays. The current crisis has presented us with a crucial task and with an opportunity to finish this job. We started unsuccessfully up to the Maastricht Treaty to complete the parallel process of deeper political integration and greater fiscal and economic harmonization at EU level. Both Brussels and national member states need courageous and determined leadership. A quick look around us makes it clear that the current sweltering climate will make it extremely difficult to get sufficient support for this from the population. Populist tendencies are visible everywhere in Europe, and it often proves to be much more rewarding to deny reality than to take responsibility. And therefore, the European parliamentary elections in 2014 will be a test case. It will be a test case, and leaders will have to convince, up to the elections, the public that our future is one of European unity and solidarity, because alone and isolated, even the strongest economies, even Germany, will not be able to face the long-term challenges that the world economy is presenting. The national economies are so heavily intertwined that leaders have to look for the best European answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Last but not least, Mr. Marcos Bonturi, we welcome you. Sorry, we apologize. You were added on the program. You are the director of the OECD, the Global Relations Secretariat. I give you the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I'll be very brief. First of all, we're running out of time, but also because the previous speakers touched on the most important issues. I just want to pick up on a couple things and go a little bit deeper in some of the things that have been said. First of all, to say that there seems today to be a certain disconnect between what we see happening in the financial markets and what we see happening in the real economy in Europe. If you look at financial markets in the past few weeks, you have equity markets booming, you have corporate spreads falling, sovereign spreads falling sharply. There's certain financial market sentiment that is definitely improving. But then if you look at the real economy in Europe, the first quarter data has been discouraging, let me put it this way. And you definitely have consumer confidence still very, very weak in the euro area. And more seriously, if you look at unemployment, which is really what we should be looking at, is not improving at all. In most of Europe, it's actually deteriorating in most parts of the euro area. And one thing to add when you look at unemployment it's important to look at what's actually happening with long-term unemployment. And this is perhaps the most serious part of the employment crisis in Europe, is that the share of long-term unemployment in overall unemployment is at all-time highs. And the people who have spent more than 1 or 2 years in unemployment it's become much more difficult for them to get back into the labor force. And more seriously, most of the social safety nets are designed in a way that these people move away from unemployment benefits to social benefits, which are much lower. So you actually aggravate the problems of inequalities in Europe and with all the political consequences that brings. So the picture is very mixed. Why is that financial markets are excited? Well, of course, in other parts of the world, there's a budding recovery. Japan is doing a little bit better. The US seems to be doing relatively well, in spite of the budget issues that they've had. Emerging markets are still growing relatively strong. You have China at 8%, Indonesia, India 5-6%, Latin America at 3-4%. So you have still, we'll say, overall global demand seems to be picking up. And at the same time, there are lots of things on the negative side for the euro area. I mean, this was mentioned here. I don't want to get into this again, but there's quite a bit of deleveraging in the private sector that still needs to go on. You have fiscal consolidation is incomplete. And of course, you have issues of the banks with credit provision still needs to increase in the next few years. So given this mixed picture, what is happening in Europe in terms of the policy side? What how are policies responding to this picture? First of all, well, we all know monetary policy is being very accommodating. I think we will, of course, think this is appropriate. But monetary policy, of course, cannot do the job alone. Problem is, of course, that there's very little fiscal space in the euro area. Again, let's get away from the doom and gloom, because if you look at what's been happening in the fiscal side in Europe, it's not only bad news. If you look at the structural part of the deficit in Europe, it's been declining. I think most of the adjustment that needed to take place from the beginning of the crisis has already taken place. I would say really most of it. Of course, with the recession, you don't see the numbers translating into a decline in the deficits, but the structural part of the deficit has been declining. I mean, still quite a bit of work to be done, but there's movement in the right direction there. Question is, of course, what now on the fiscal side? We have to be very, and then I agree with most of what other speakers have said, we have to be very careful on fiscal consolidation. We should not have a blind fiscal consolidation. I mean, there's a need still to do a little bit of homework, but we need a bit of a smart fiscal consolidation, both in terms of the structure, but also in terms of the timing. And I think this is, policymakers in Europe are realizing this more and more as we go forward. And I think we have to pay very, very strong attention to the trade-offs between the short-term growth, the effects on short-term growth, the effects on long-term growth, the effects on inequalities and social pain of fiscal consolidation. And if you manage to balance this out, perhaps you can have a pace of fiscal consolidation and a shape of fiscal consolidation that will make sense and inspire confidence going forward. But given then that there's very little fiscal space, the answer has to be, and Jacob said that at the very beginning, the answer is go structural. And even there, if the news are not always only bad in the euro area. If you look at all the structural reforms that have been taking place, especially in the crisis countries, let me put it this way, they have done quite a number. They have undertaken quite a number of very, very important structural reforms, which were long overdue, but they've done it, and there's a political economy argument there. They had to do it, but if you look at it, that they have implemented a number of reforms that have improved their competitiveness, and this already shows very, very clearly in a certain rebalancing of their economies. And if you look at overall imbalances, be it in terms of current account balances, be it in terms of unit labor costs, exports, you see that this is already happening. And in some of the countries like Spain, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, they are already seeing a major improvement in competitiveness in a broader sense. That said, again, still much to go, much to be done. That we are not out of the woods yet. There's quite a bit of reform that still needs to take place. And one thing I perhaps people forget sometimes, reforms are needed not only in the deficit countries, let me call them the deficit countries. We still need, in the surplus countries, we still need a number of structural reforms that are not taking place, and not taking place fast enough. And that something perhaps we should push towards, and it's easier for the German taxpayer or the Austrian taxpayer or the Dutch taxpayer to see this in a different terms, rather than saying that, well, right, you need to behave more like the people in the South. But that's not necessarily what we're talking about here, is that if you implement certain reforms that have been restraining, let's say, to get away some barriers which has been restraining domestic demand in your own countries, for instance, in the service sector, we mentioned that there are lots of barriers to service trade within Europe, and lots of very outdated regulations in some of the surplus countries, that if we were to help these countries remove those barriers, you have an effect of increasing domestic demand. So nobody's asking them to implement a blind fiscal stimulus, but we're telling in their own interests that there are measures that they can take to boost domestic demand and then help the euro area as a whole and speed up this rebalancing, which so far has been only one-sided. You know? So that's perhaps a more positive message that we can send to taxpayers in the surplus countries. Again, I'm not going to go too far into the issue of the banking union. That's an essential element of the solution. Europe will not get out of the doldrums if it doesn't put in place a serious system to address this and break this link, this feedback loop between the sovereign risk and the banking risk, which is really hampering lending, especially if you look at enterprises in the deficit countries are suffering tremendously from lack of credit, especially SMEs in countries like Spain or Italy. So that's, of course, is an essential element of the package that needs to be taken into consideration. I would be remiss if I were not to take one step back and start thinking about what kind of lessons really, and that's more globally, it's not only about Europe, can we take from this crisis? What has gone wrong? And what is our collective responsibility? And what do we need to do about it? I think first of all, we have to be humble that maybe we were a little bit too keen and blind in looking at our own macroeconomic models, and I speak for the OECD, so I know what I'm talking about. I mean, I think especially if you look at some of the assumptions about the self-equilibrating character of markets. I think this is a myth, and perhaps we should be a bit more open to look at other types of equilibrium and intermediate equilibriums. There's also something we have to be aware of, and I'll pick up on some of the examples that were cited here. Spain. If you were to look at Spain, indeed, before the crisis, it was a model euro area country. But there were lots of imbalances building up. Most of the job creation that happened in Spain in the boom years were in the construction sector. There was a real estate boom. Maybe if you looked at other indicators, I mean, like the current account, for instance, you would definitely see that there were problems building up and the lack of competitiveness that was building on unit labor costs. So that's the type of thing perhaps we should pay more attention on broader variables and think perhaps revisit the objectives of our own macro policies, perhaps bringing in a certain flavor of this tensions between the different policy objectives that we have, between growth, stability, inequality, issues related to environment. Perhaps we have to mix them in and understand better how those trade-offs are made. I will stop here, but I just cannot resist using a metaphor that my boss, Angel Gurria, uses very, very often when talking about Europe. It's a very mixed picture. The impression that we have sometimes when we look at Europe, that we see this very ugly scaffolding like we have in the old cathedrals, now that you have years and years spending in renovation, and they just go by in Milan or in other cities in Europe. You see this ugly scaffolding covering the beautiful cathedral, and then you say men and women at work, and years and years and years and years, and is in construction, Then all of a sudden, the work is done, and you remove the scaffolding, and then you have this beautiful architecture that just cries at you and warms your heart. So I would dare to be a little bit optimistic that all the scaffolding that we see today maybe will reveal eventually, with the right political courage, a very beautiful architecture, which is what Europe is known for. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are not going to be able to launch a debate on the Eurozone as a couple of our speakers needs to leave. So what I will suggest is maybe as a coffee break, you might be able to interact with our speakers. I just want to conclude to thank all our speakers this afternoon. I think in the vocabulary of the Eurozone, you remember when the Euro started, we always talk about convergence. Today we talk about divergence, we talk about fragmentations, and we talk, as Dominic said, about maybe a decade of adjustment in the Eurozone. But in the meantime, we always talk about game changer. And the game changer in Europe was maybe in July when the head of the ECB said in one statement that the ECB would do whatever it takes to keep the integrity of the euro. And as he said, believe me, will be enough. And remember, market overreacted. So let's wait for a game changer, maybe coming from Germany after the elections. Thank you.